secret. At that time, driven by a certain capricious thought, I decided to distance myself from the lively atmosphere that had surrounded me until then. I sought to quietly escape the circle of men and women with whom I had maintained relationships for various reasons. After searching far and wide for a suitable hiding place, I finally found a Shingon temple in the Matsuba district of Asakusa and managed to rent a small room in its priest's quarters. The temple was located in an obscure part of town, down the Newbury Canal, heading straight from Kikuya Bridge along the back of the Monziki Temple grounds. Nestled in the tangled, oppressive neighborhoods beneath the 12-stories tower, it sat on the edge of a slum that sprawled across the area like an overturned trash heap. The temple was surrounded by a long ochre-yellow earthen wall, exuding a calm, solemn, and melancholic atmosphere. From the beginning, I had thought that rather than retreating to suburbs like Shibuya or Okubo, there might be a mysterious, desolate spot hidden somewhere within the city, one so peculiar that only in rare circumstances or by special types of people would it be frequented. Just as eddies form in spots along a fast-flowing mountain stream, I imagined there must be quiet enclaves tucked away amid the hustle and bustle of the downtown streets. At the same time, another thought crossed my mind. I've always enjoyed traveling, wandering from Kyoto to Sendai, from Hokkaido to Kyushu. Yet here in Tokyo, where I've lived my entire 20-some years since being born in Ningyocho, there are undoubtedly streets I've never set foot on, even within the very city where I reside. No, surely, there must be far more of them than I imagined. As I pondered this, I found myself wondering, in this sprawling metropolis of downtown Tokyo, where countless streets intertwine like a honeycomb, have I traversed more of the places, or left more untouched? The answer became increasingly unclear. I believe I was around 11 or 12 years old. One time, when I went with my father to the Hachiman Shrine in Fukagawa, he said, "Shall we take the ferry from here and have some of the famous soba at the rice market in Fuyugi?" With that, he led me to the back of the shrine's precincts. There, unlike the canals around Kiwamicho or Kobunicho, was a narrow, low-banked river, swollen with water, flowing sluggishly as if it were pushing apart the tightly packed houses lining its banks. A small ferry boat shuttled back and forth, barely maneuvering through a line of cargo boats and tenma boats that seemed even longer than the width of the river. The ferryman pushed the riverbed lightly with his pole, crossing in just 2 or 3 strokes. Until that day, though I had visited the Hachiman Shrine many times, I had never thought about what lay behind the shrine. I would always just approach the main hall from the front torii gate and pray, assuming it was like a panoramic picture, only a facade with no backside, like a dead-end view. But now, before my eyes, there was a river and a ferry landing, and beyond that stretched an endless expanse of land. This mysterious sight felt somehow more removed from Tokyo than even Kyoto or Osaka, like the kind of world that often appears in dreams. I then tried to imagine what kind of town lay behind the Cannon Hall in Asakusa, but all I could clearly recall was the view of its grand vermilion roof seen from the Nakamai shopping street. Beyond that, nothing else came to mind. As I grew older and my world expanded, visiting friends' houses, going on outings for cherry blossom viewing, or walking all around Tokyo, I often stumbled upon such strange, otherworldly places, just like those I had encountered as a child. I came to think that these otherworldly places were ideal hiding spots. The more I searched here and there, the more I discovered areas I had never been to before. Although I had crossed both Asakusa-bashi and Izumi-bashi countless times, I had never crossed the Seinen-bashi in between them. When visiting the Ikimuraza Theater in Nikamachi, I always turned right at the noodle shop corner from the tram road, but I had never walked straight ahead past the theater to Yanajimariza. From the right bank of the old Eitai Bridge, I had no clear idea of what the left side river bank looked like. There seemed to be countless places I had yet to explore, around Hakobori, Ikitsunbori, Shimizunbori, and Sanyobori. The neighborhood around the temple in Matsuba-cho was the most peculiar of all. Situated just a short turn down an alley, with Roku in Yoshiwara right at its doorstep, it formed a quiet, desolate-looking area that greatly appealed to me. Leaving behind my so-called best friend, the flashy, extravagant, yet utterly mundane Tokyo, I found immense pleasure in quietly hiding myself there while observing its bustling chaos from the sidelines. The purpose of my seclusion wasn't to study or anything of the sort. At that time, my nerves were like a file whose sharp edges had been completely worn down. Unless I encountered something intensely vivid or striking, I couldn't feel any sense of excitement. I had lost the ability to appreciate refined things, whether it was the artistry of fine cuisine or the subtleties of high art, which required a delicate sensitivity to enjoy. I was no longer impressed by the culinary skills of chefs in so-called sophisticated tea houses of the downtown area, nor by the craftsmanship of actors like Niziman or Ganjiro. My spirit had grown too rough to find any pleasure in the usual entertainments of city life. I found myself unable to bear the monotony of repeating the same dull, lifeless routine every day. I wanted to break free entirely from the conventions of the past and discover a peculiar, artificial mode of life, driven by whim. Was there something strange or mysterious enough to shake my nerves, dulled as they were by ordinary stimuli? Could I exist in a savage, fantastical, and dreamlike atmosphere far removed from reality? With these thoughts, my soul wandered into the ancient, legendary worlds of Babylon and Assyria, imagined the detective stories of Conan Doyle or Ruiko, yearned for the scorched deserts and lush fields of tropical regions bathed in intense sunlight, and longed for the eccentric mischief of my unruly boyhood days. Even simply disappearing unexpectedly from the bustling world and keeping my actions utterly secret seemed enough to imbue my life with a sense of mystery and romance. I had cherished the charm of secrecy ever since I was a child. Whether it was playing hide and seek, treasure hunting, or games like Shabozu, their thrill lay largely in the peculiar sense of secrecy lurking within them, especially when played on dark nights, in dim storage sheds, or near cabinet doors swung wide open. That, undoubtedly, was the reason for their allure. I deliberately hid myself in an indistinct part of downtown Tokyo where no one would notice me, driven by a desire to relive the feelings of playing hide and seek during my childhood. The fact that the temple belonged to the Shingon sect, deeply connected to concepts like secrets, magic spells, and curses, further piqued my curiosity and fostered my imagination. The room I rented was part of a recently added section of the temple's kitchen quarters. It was a south-facing, 8-mat room with tatami mats that had slightly browned from sun exposure, lending a calm and cozy warmth to the space. In the afternoon, the gentle autumn sunlight poured in, glowing vividly against the shoji screens on the veranda like a magic lantern, making the room as bright as a large paper lantern. I stashed away all the books on philosophy and art that I had been familiar with until then, tucking them into a cabinet, and instead filled the room with strange books on magic, hypnosis, detective stories, chemistry, anatomy, and other topics. The books, brimming with bizarre tales and illustrations, were scattered all over the room as if for midsummer airing. Lying around on the floor, I picked them up at random and read voraciously. Among them were Conan Doyle's The Sign of Four, De Quincey's Murder, considered as one of the fine arts, fairy tales like Arabian Nights, and even strange French books on sexology. With great persistence, I managed to persuade the temple's abbot to lend me some of his hidden Buddhist artworks, including depictions of heaven and hell, Mount Meru, and Nirvana. I hung these old Buddhist paintings on the walls, much like maps displayed in a school staff room, covering every available space. From the incense burner in the alcove, a steady stream of purple smoke rose silently and peacefully, filling the bright and warm room with its fragrance. I frequently visited a nearby shop at Kikuyabashi to buy sandalwood or agarwood incense, which I would then burn. On fine days, when the bright midday sunlight shone brilliantly against the shoji, the room offered a breathtaking spectacle. The vivid colors of the ancient Buddhist paintings, depicting various deities, arhats, monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, elephants, lions, and kirin, seemed to swim out of the frames, basking in the abundance of light. From the countless books scattered across the tatami, stories of murder, anesthesia, magic potions, enchantresses, and religion mingled, blending into the incense smoke that drifted hazily through the room. In the midst of this haze, I laid out a two-mat red carpet and sprawled on it, my eyes fixed in a heavy, barbaric gaze. Day after day, I conjured vivid hallucinations in my mind. Around 9 at night, once the people at the temple had mostly gone to sleep, I would take a swig from a bottle of whiskey to induce a mild intoxication. Afterward, I would quietly slide open the veranda storm shutters, climb over the hedge by the cemetery, and head out for a stroll. To avoid drawing attention, I changed my attire each night, walking through the bustling crowds at the park, browsing the displays at antique shops and second-hand bookstores. Sometimes I would wear a hood over my head, drape myself in a striped Tucson jacket, polish my bare feet until they gleamed, apply red dye to my toenails, and step into set of sandals. Other nights, I would don tinted glasses with gold frames, flip up the collar of a double-breasted coat, or experiment with fake beards, moles, or birthmarks, finding amusement in transforming my appearance. One evening, at a second-hand clothing shop by Shamizambori, I came across a woman's awase kimono with a pattern of small checks scattered on an indigo background. From that moment, I couldn't shake the desire to try it on. I had a peculiar attachment to clothing and fabrics, one that went beyond appreciating a pleasing color or stylish pattern. Whether men's or women's garments, encountering beautiful silk materials, seeing them or touching them, often sent a shiver through me, evoking the kind of intense pleasure akin to gazing upon a lover's skin. Particularly, I envied the freedom women had to adorn themselves with gorgeous omeshi or kiraman silks without societal judgment. When I thought of the kiraman awase kimono hanging vividly in that shop, I trembled at the thought of its soft, heavy, and cool fabric clinging tightly to my body. I couldn't resist the urge to wear the kimono and walk the streets disguised as a woman. Without hesitation, I decided to buy it. I also picked up a yuzen long undergarment and a black kiraman haori to complete the outfit. The kimono seemed to have belonged to a tall woman, and its measurements were perfectly suited to my small frame. Late at night, when the temple had fallen utterly silent, I secretly sat before the dressing table and began applying makeup. The moment I smeared a generous amount of creamy white powder onto the yellowish base of my nose, my reflection appeared somewhat grotesque. However, as I spread the thick, sweet-smelling paste evenly across my face with the palm of my hand, I found the smooth application surprisingly satisfying. The cool, dewy sensation as it seeped into the pores of my skin brought an exceptional kind of delight. As I added rouge and vermilion, my previously stark white, plaster-like face transformed into the vibrant complexion of a lively woman. The process was exhilarating. I realized that the art of makeup, performed daily by actors, geishas, and ordinary women, using their own bodies as canvases, was far more fascinating than the artistic pursuits of writers or painters. Wearing the nagajubin, a half collar, a koshimaki sash, and the softly rustling banibani silk-lined sleeves, my body began to experience sensations identical to those felt by the skin of an ordinary woman. I painted my nape and wrists white, placed a icho geishi wig on my head, and donned an okoso zukin hood. Finally, mustering my courage, I ventured into the nighttime streets, blending into the flow of passers-by. It was a dark, drizzly evening under rain-laden clouds. I wandered aimlessly through the desolate, ditch-laden streets of Senzaku, Kiyosumi, and Ryuzenji neighborhoods. Despite crossing paths with patrolling officers and the occasional pedestrian, none seemed to take any notice of me. The night wind brushed coolly over my powdered face, which felt as dry and taut as if a layer of parchment had been stretched across it. The fabric of the hood, dampened by my breath, clung moistly to my lips, while the hem of my long kiraman sash swirled playfully around my legs with each step. The tight pressure of the wide sash around my midsection and the girdle binding my pelvis made my blood feel as if it were flowing like that of a woman. Gradually, the masculine sensations and posture of my body seemed to dissolve. When I extended a powdered hand from beneath the flowing Yuzen sleeves, the usual firm, rugged contours of my fingers disappeared into the night, leaving only a pale, soft, and gently rounded hand illuminated in the darkness. I found myself captivated by the beauty of my own hand. I envied women who naturally possessed such exquisite hands. Like Benten Kozo from the kabuki plays, I imagined myself committing various crimes in this guise. How thrilling it would be! Immersed in the atmospheric mystery and suspicion that pervade detective and crime fiction, I unconsciously began walking toward the bustling 6th District and its park. As I strolled, I deluded myself into believing I was a murderer, a robber, or someone capable of heinous, cruel deeds. When I passed in front of the 12-story tower and reached the edge of the pond, I arrived at the Opera House's four-cornered intersection. Here, the glow of the illuminations and arc lights sparkled on my heavily made-up face. The patterns and colors of my kimono were vividly displayed in the artificial brilliance. By the time I reached the Tokiwaza Theater, I found myself at the entrance of a photo studio. There, in a large mirror mounted in the entryway, amidst the bustling crowd, I saw my reflection, a complete transformation into a strikingly convincing woman. Beneath the thickly applied layer of white powder, every trace of my male identity was thoroughly concealed. My eyes and mouth moved and smiled like those of a woman. With the sweet scent of cosmetics and the soft, whispering sound of silk brushing against itself, the women passing by me, those ahead and those behind, acknowledged me as one of their own without a hint of suspicion. Some among them even cast envious glances at the elegance of my features and my preference for old-fashioned attire. The nightly turmoil of the park, so familiar to me, appeared utterly transformed through the lens of the secret I now carried. Everything I encountered seemed fresh and unfamiliar, as though I were experiencing it for the first time, wondrous and strange. Perhaps the mundane realities of life appeared dreamlike and imbued with vibrant, otherworldly colors because I viewed them from behind the veil of my disguise, deceiving human eyes and even the harsh glare of electric lights, all while hidden beneath a rich cloak of makeup and silk garments. Night after night, I continued this masquerade. Eventually, I grew bold enough to blend casually into the standing room crowds at the Miyato Theater or among spectators of silent films. I returned to the temple close to midnight. Once back in my room, I would immediately light the gas lamp. Too weary to remove my elaborate costume, I would collapse onto the scarlet felt mat in a languid sprawl, gazing wistfully at the splendid colors of my kimono or idly flicking the sleeves back and forth. As I stared into the mirror, the remnants of my makeup had seeped into the loose, coarse skin of my cheeks. There was a certain decadent pleasure in this sight, a sensation akin to the heady intoxication of aged wine, a feeling that stirred my soul. With the Jigoku Gokuraku, heaven and hell, illustrations as my backdrop, I would lie belly down on the futon, draped like a courtesan in a garish nagajuban, and pore over the pages of my strange books late into the night. Over time, my disguises grew more skillful, and my confidence increased. To cultivate an air of intrigue, I began to carry props like a dagger or a vial of anesthetic tucked into my sash when I ventured out. I wanted to savor the beautiful, romantic aroma associated with crime, without actually committing one. And then, one evening, about a week into this nightly escapade, I unexpectedly found myself drawn into the beginnings of a strange and fateful encounter. It was something far more bizarre, far more curious, and far more mysterious than anything I had anticipated. That night, after drinking more whiskey than usual, I found myself seated in the private guest box on the second floor of the Sanyukan Theater. It must have been close to 10 o'clock. The stiflingly crowded venue was filled with a foggy, murky atmosphere, thick and oppressive. The damp warmth emanating from the tightly packed crowd below seemed to cling to my face, threatening to spoil the white powder I had applied. As the film's flickering images flashed and whirred across the screen, the light pierced my eyes in dizzying bursts, and my intoxicated head throbbed as if it were splitting apart. Occasionally, When the film cut out and the house lights flared on, I peered out from the deep shadow of my hood, scanning the faces of the people filling the hall. The glow of the electric lights illuminated the swirling cigarette smoke that hovered over the heads of the audience like clouds rising from a ravine. I couldn't help but notice the men who curiously eyed my old-fashioned hood, or the women who stole envious glances at the chic colors of my attire. Secretly, I felt a sense of pride. Among the women in the audience, none seemed to attract as much attention as I did, not for my peculiar outfit, nor for my elegant air, nor even for my features, which seemed to captivate onlookers. At some point, without my realizing it, the empty seat beside me in the private box had been taken. When the house lights flicked on again, I noticed that a man and a woman had seated themselves to my left. The woman appeared to be about 22 or 23, though she might have been as young as 16 or 17. Her hair was styled in a three-ring bun, and she was wrapped entirely in a sky-blue omeshi cloak, her strikingly beautiful features on full display, as if daring anyone to look at her. It was difficult to discern whether she was a geisha or a young lady of refined upbringing, but judging by the demeanor of her male companion, she did not seem to be the wife of an upstanding gentleman. Arrested at last. She softly read aloud the explanatory caption that appeared on the film, then blew a fragrant puff of Turkish MCC cigarette smoke in my direction. As she did so, her large, piercing eyes, which sparkled even more brilliantly than the jewels on her fingers, briefly turned to me in the darkness. Her refined appearance contrasted sharply with her raspy, hoarse voice, reminiscent of a teacher of the shamisen with its thick neck. That voice was unmistakable. It belonged to T, a woman with whom I had once had a brief acquaintance during a voyage to Shanghai 2 or 3 years ago. I recalled that even back then, the woman displayed manners and attire that made it difficult to distinguish whether she was a professional or an amateur. The man who had accompanied her on the ship and the man with her tonight were entirely different in appearance and demeanor, but I surmised that countless men must have bridged the gap between them, linking her life like the rings of a chain. In any case, it was certain that she was the type of woman who flitted like a butterfly from one man to another. 2 years ago, when we became acquainted on the ship, we refrained from revealing our true names, circumstances, or addresses due to various reasons, parting ways upon our arrival in Shanghai. At the time, I had misled her, who was infatuated with me, and slipped away without a trace. Since then, I had regarded her as nothing more than a dreamlike figure lost somewhere in the Pacific. To encounter her again in such a place was wholly unexpected. The woman, who had been slightly plump back then, had now slimmed down to an almost divine elegance. Her rounded eyes, now enhanced with long, glistening eyelashes, shone with a clarity that seemed to wipe away the past. Her presence exuded an almost regal authority, as if she considered men beneath her notice. Her vivid lips, which seemed as if they might stain anything they touched with crimson blood, and the long hairline that nearly concealed her earlobes, were unchanged from before. However, her nose appeared slightly sharper and more pronounced than it had been. Had she noticed me? I could not be sure. When the lights came on, she whispered and flirted with her male companion in a way that suggested she regarded me, sitting beside her, as an ordinary woman, something unworthy of her attention. In truth, sitting next to her, I could no longer take pride in my own disguise. Overwhelmed by the vibrant charm of this enchanting woman, whose expressions were so natural and lively, my meticulously crafted makeup and attire suddenly seemed grotesque, like those of a pathetic monster. In terms of femininity or beauty, I was no match for her. Next to her, I felt as insignificant and dim as a star in the presence of the moon, utterly withered and diminished. In the murky air of the theater, thick with haze, her vivid, clear contours stood out sharply, her graceful hand occasionally darting from the shadow of her mantle like a fish swimming. Even while conversing with the man, she would often lift her dreamlike gaze to the ceiling, furrow her brows and look down on the crowd, or reveal her white teeth in a smile. Each time, a completely different expression would overflow with meaning. Her large, dark eyes, glittering like jewels, could be seen even from distant corners of the room. The entire face, overflowing with nuance, seemed not merely an instrument for seeing, smelling, hearing, or speaking, but rather a seductive bait to tempt a man's heart. By now, no one in the room was paying any attention to me. Foolishly, I began to feel jealousy and rage toward the beauty of the woman who had stolen my popularity. The sudden frustration of being overshadowed, trampled by the charm of a woman I had once carelessly discarded, stirred within me. Perhaps, I thought, she was deliberately mocking me, exacting a sarcastic revenge for something she had recognized in me. I felt the emotion of jealousy, born from envy of her beauty, slowly transform into longing. Having lost the competition as a woman, I now wished to conquer her again as a man and win in triumph. This thought drove me with an uncontrollable desire, and I wanted, in a sudden surge, to grab her supple body, shake her, and claim her for myself. Do you know who I am? Tonight, after seeing you again for the first time in a long while, I have begun to love you once more. Do you have no desire to shake my hand once again? Will you not come to this seat tomorrow night and wait for me? Though I do not wish to reveal my address to anyone, all I ask is that tomorrow, at this time, you come here and wait for me. In the darkness, I secretly took out a piece of paper and a pencil from my waistband and wrote these hasty words, which I quietly threw into the woman's sleeve. I then waited, watching her from a distance. Around 11 o'clock, the woman had quietly watched the movie until it ended. When the audience rose in unison and began to crowd out of the theater, she leaned close to my ear again and whispered, "Arrested at last." She gazed at my face with a more confident, bold stare for a moment, before disappearing into the crowd with the man. Arrested at last. She had somehow spotted me. I froze, startled. But will she come tomorrow night, as she promised? With doubts and uncertainties rising, I wondered whether my reckless actions had exposed my weaknesses, especially now that the man seemed to have more experience than I. I returned to the temple, uneasy. As usual, when I took off my coat and was about to undress to my undergarment, a small square of foreign paper fell out from under my hood. It was written in ink, the words Mr. S. K, faintly visible through the paper, glowing like a silk thread. It was indeed her handwriting. It seemed she had gotten up a few times during the performance, and in that short time, had prepared a reply, secretly slipping it into my collar. I never expected to see you in such an unexpected place. Even though you have changed your attire, how could I possibly fail to recognize the face I have not forgotten for the past 3 years, even in my dreams? I have always known you to be the woman in the hood. How amusing it is, then, that you, with your ever-present curiosity, have made yourself known once again. Though you may say you wish to meet me, I suspect it is more for the sake of your own whims. But despite my doubts, I am so happy that I cannot help myself and will, without hesitation, follow your instructions. I shall certainly wait for you tomorrow night. However, I have some matters to attend to. If you would come between 9 and 9:30, you may come to the Kaminarimon gate. There, the driver I have sent will find you and escort you to my house. Just as you keep your address a secret, I too will not reveal mine. I have arranged for the driver to blindfold you during the ride. I ask that you consent to this plan. If you do not, I shall never see you again, and there can be no greater sorrow for me. As I read this letter, I felt as though I had unknowingly become a character in a detective novel. A strange mix of curiosity and fear swirled in my mind. I wondered if the woman was aware of her own tendencies and was purposely playing this game. The following evening, there was a heavy downpour. I changed my clothes completely, wearing a rubber-coated coat over a thick silk kimono, and stepped outside into the torrential rain. The streets were flooded, and I had to tuck my tabi, footwear, into my kimono. My bare feet, drenched, shimmered in the light of the street lamps. The relentless rain drowned out all sound, and the normally busy streets were quiet, with most of the shops shuttered. Only a few men, huddled and running like defeated soldiers, dashed by. The electric trains occasionally splashed water from the rails as they passed, and the dim lights from the utility poles and advertisements barely pierced the foggy, rain-soaked air. Soaked from my coat, wrists, and up to my elbows, I finally arrived at Kaminarimon. Standing in the rain, I looked around, peering through the light of the arc lamp, but saw no one. Perhaps someone was hiding in a dark corner, watching me. As I stood there for a moment, a red lantern light began to move from the direction of Azuma Bridge's darkness, and the sound of streetcar wheels clattering on the cobblestones echoed closer. An old-fashioned rickshaw came to a stop right in front of me. "Sir, please get in," said the rickshaw puller, whose voice was almost drowned out by the rain striking the wheel axles. The man suddenly moved behind me and quickly wrapped a piece of soft cloth around my eyes, pulling it tightly, making my temples ache. "Now, please board," he said. His rough hands grabbed me, hurriedly lifting me into the rickshaw. The damp smell of the canopy filled the air as raindrops fell lightly. Undoubtedly, a woman sat beside me. The scent of white powder and her warm body heat enveloped the inside of the canopy. The rickshaw began to move, turning in circles a few times to obscure its direction, then veering right and left, making it seem as if we were wandering through a labyrinth. At times, it would emerge onto the streetcar lanes or cross small bridges. I was jolted about in the rickshaw for a long time. The woman sitting beside me was undoubtedly the same woman from earlier, but she sat silently, without shifting. She was likely there to ensure that my blindfold remained intact. However, even without someone overseeing it, I had no intention of removing the blindfold. The woman I had met on the sea, the rain-soaked evening, the secrecy of the night in the city, blindness, silence, everything had merged into one, and I was thrown into a mist of mystery. Eventually, the woman parted my tightly closed lips and inserted a cigarette into my mouth. She struck a match and lit it for me. About an hour later, the rickshaw finally stopped. The rough hand of the man led me through a narrow alley for a few steps, then opened what seemed like a back gate with a creak and took me inside the house. Left alone in a room with my eyes still covered, I sat quietly for a while. Soon, I heard the sound of the Fusuma, sliding door, opening. The woman, without a word, moved toward me like a mermaid, her body slinking over to rest her upper body against my lap, and then she draped her arms around my neck. She untied the knot of her haori, silk robe, with a light movement. The room was about 8 tatami mats in size. The construction and decoration were quite elegant, with well-chosen wooden furnishings. However, much like the woman's unclear status, it was impossible to determine whether this was a waiting room, a courtesan's house, or a respectable upper-class home. Outside, there was a small garden, and beyond it, a wooden fence surrounded the property. With only this limited view, I couldn't even guess where in Tokyo this house might be located. "Thank you for coming," she said as she leaned against a square blackwood desk in the center of the room, letting her white arms hang limply on the surface, like two lifeless creatures. Her attire, a sober striped kimono with a wide obi tied in the classic ginkgo pattern, was completely different from the appearance she had shown last night, and I was struck with surprise. "You must think it's strange that I'm like this tonight," she continued. "But if I'm to keep my identity secret, there's no choice but to change my appearance every day." She lifted a wine glass from the table, filled it with grape wine, and as she spoke, her manner was surprisingly demure and subdued. "But you remembered me well. After we parted in Shanghai, I went through a lot of hardships with various men, but strangely, I could never forget you. This time, please don't leave me. Even though I don't know my own status or background, please stay with me, thinking of me as a dreamlike woman." Each word the woman spoke resonated in my chest, like the melody of a song from a distant land, tinged with sorrow. How could the bold, clever woman from last night show such a melancholic and humble demeanor now? It was as though she had cast aside everything and laid her soul before me. The woman from the dream. The secret woman, the fascination of a love adventure, vague and indistinguishable from reality or illusion, filled me. From that point on, I visited her nearly every night. We would spend time together until around 2 a.m., then I would have my eyes covered and be sent back to the Thunder Gate. For a month, 2 months, we met without knowing each other's real names or backgrounds. I had no interest in discovering her circumstances or where she lived, but as time passed, a strange curiosity grew within me. I wanted to know where the rickshaw was taking us, whether it was heading toward the east or west side of Tokyo. I became increasingly eager to find out the neighborhood we were passing through, the route we were taking. After traveling for 30 minutes, an hour, sometimes even an hour and a half, the destination of the rickshaw seemed to be surprisingly close to the Thunder Gate. As the days passed, I couldn't help but speculate in my mind, are we here? Or there? One night, I could no longer hold back. Just a little, please. Take off this blindfold, I begged her on the rickshaw. No, no, she said, hurriedly holding my hands and pressing her face against them. Please, don't be so selfish. This street is my secret. If you learn this secret, you might abandon me. Why would I abandon you? I asked. If you did, I wouldn't be the woman from the dream anymore. You love the woman from the dream more than you love me. I begged her in various ways, but she wouldn't listen to me. Well, if you insist, I'll show you. But just for a moment, she sighed and, with a reluctant movement, removed the cloth from my eyes. Do you know where we are? She made a face that seemed uncertain. The sky, once beautifully clear, was strangely darkened, with stars sparkling all around, and the Milky Way flowed like white mist from one end to the other. On both sides of the narrow street, shops lined the road, and the lights from the lanterns brightly illuminated the town. Strangely enough, although it seemed to be a rather bustling street, I had no idea where I was. The rickshaw continued down the street, and eventually, at the end of the block, I saw a large sign that read CB-Do, an engraving shop. As I leaned forward in the rickshaw, trying to read the small letters of the street name and number beside the sign, the woman quickly noticed and said, "Oh," and immediately covered my eyes again. The bustling street with shops leading to the sign of the engraving shop, it seemed unmistakably like a place I had never been before. The feeling was like being led into a mysterious world, much like the one I had experienced as a child. "Did you read the characters on that sign?" she asked. "No, I couldn't. I have no idea where we are. The only thing I know about you is what I remember from 3 years ago, when we were on the Pacific Ocean. It feels as though I've been brought to some distant, illusionary country by you." When I answered like this, the woman spoke in a deeply sorrowful voice. "Please, always think of me that way. Think of me as the woman in your dreams, from a country of illusions. Never again ask for something like you did tonight." Tears seemed to flow from the woman's eyes. For some time after that night, I couldn't forget the mysterious scene of the town that the woman had shown me. The sign of the engraving shop, visible at the end of the narrow, bustling alley lit by lanterns, was clearly impressed in my mind. I struggled to find that town, but after much effort, I finally devised a plan. Over the long months of nightly rides, I began to notice a pattern in the way the rickshaw turned and twisted, the number of times it circled at Kaminarimon, the number of right and left turns. It became a familiar rhythm. One morning, I stood at the corner of Kaminarimon, closed my eyes, and spun around a few times. When I felt it was about right, I took off running at the same speed as the rickshaw. There was no way but to judge the time and to turn down alleyways here and there, but after a while, I arrived at a spot that seemed just like the one I had been searching for. There was a bridge, a streetcar line, and everything matched my memory. The road began at Kaminarimon, wrapped around the park's outskirts, and led to Chitose-maki. It then turned into a narrow street in Ryuzenji-maki, heading toward Ueno. At the bottom of the hill, it veered left, and after walking for a few blocks along the bustling Kachimachio, it started to turn left again. That was where I suddenly found myself facing the same narrow alley. Indeed, the sign of the engraving shop was right ahead. I moved forward, determined to investigate the hidden secret of this mysterious place, almost like delving into a cave. But when I reached the end of the street, I was unexpectedly at the continuation of the night market street in Shitaya Takemaki. The second-hand shop where I had bought a small patterned crepe kimono was just a few paces ahead. The mysterious alley, it turned out, connected the streets of Shimisenbori and Otomachi, but I had no memory of ever passing through it before. Standing before the familiar Saibido sign, I paused for a while. Beneath the brilliant starry sky, shrouded in a dreamlike, mysterious atmosphere, everything felt completely different from the warm, red lights of the night. Looking at the shabby, sun-baked houses with their dry, cracked facades, I couldn't help but feel disappointed and lose interest all at once. Driven by an uncontrollable curiosity, like a dog sniffing the scent on the street as it returns to its home, I once again set off, following my intuition. The road took me back into Asakusa, heading right from Kojima Maki, crossing the train tracks near Sugabashi, and turning toward Ryogoku along the Daichi riverbank. Finally, I reached the broad street of Ryogoku. It became clear that the woman had been trying her best to confuse the direction with a large detour. After passing through Yaganbori, Hisamatsumaki, and Hamamachi, I crossed the Kakihama Bridge, but then I lost track of the way ahead. It seemed the woman's house was somewhere in this area. After about an hour of wandering in the narrow alleys of the neighborhood, I finally found a small, almost hidden street, nestled between houses on the opposite side of Doryogonin. I instinctively knew that her house was hidden within it. As I entered, I could see her from the second floor of a house with a beautifully polished wooden fence. She stood there, gazing down at me with a face as pale as a corpse, hiding behind the pine branches. Without thinking, I glanced up mockingly toward the second floor, but the woman, pretending to be a different person as though to disguise herself, silently watched me without a smile. Her appearance was so different from the one I had seen at night that I almost didn't recognize her. In that brief moment, the regret and disappointment of having her secret uncovered became clear on her face, and she quietly disappeared behind the shoji screen. The woman, whose name was Yoshino, was a widow from the nearby neighborhood. Just like the sign of the engraving shop, all the mysteries had been solved. After that, I never saw her again. A few days later, I suddenly decided to leave the temple and move to the Tabata area. My heart gradually grew dissatisfied with the faint and mild pleasure of secrets, and I found myself leaning more toward seeking pleasures that were darker, more vivid, and drenched in blood.